Ted Kaczynski. For nearly 2 decades, the most wanted man in America was someone the FBI couldn't picture, couldn't name, and couldn't explain. They knew he built bombs. They knew he mailed them to strangers who had never met him. What they did not know was that he was a former mathematics professor with a genius-level intellect, living alone in a plywood cabin in the Montana woods, writing his plans by candlelight. By the time investigators finally learned his name, he had killed 3 people and injured 23 others across 17 years, and the only reason they caught him at all was that his own brother recognized the way he wrote. Theodore John Kaczynski was a child prodigy who entered Harvard at 16 and earned a doctorate in mathematics before taking a professorship at the University of California, Berkeley. He walked away from all of it in the early 1970s, retreating to a 10 by 14-foot cabin near Lincoln, Montana, with no electricity and no running water. From there, beginning in 1978, he ran a mail bombing campaign that stretched until 1995. He admitted to 16 bombings in total, targeting universities and airlines, which is where the FBI code name for the case, Unabomb, came from. One device was designed to detonate by altitude aboard an American Airlines flight in 1979. That it failed to bring the plane down was a matter of engineering, not intent. His victims were adults, and several were maimed for life. But what set Kaczynski apart was not just the violence, it was the manifesto. In 1995, he demanded that major newspapers publish a roughly 35,000-word essay laying out his philosophy about industrial society, threatening more attacks if they refused. After the Attorney General signed off, the Washington Post ran it, and that decision is what ended the case. His brother David read the published text, recognized the phrasing and the ideas from letters written years earlier, and, after agonizing over it, contacted the FBI. Agents arrested him at his cabin on April 3, 1996. Inside, they found journals, a coded diary, bomb components, and 2 completed devices ready to mail. He pleaded guilty to all 16 bombings, a plea driven almost entirely by the threat of a death sentence. And in May of 1998, he received 4 consecutive life terms plus 30 years, with no possibility of parole. That sentence sent him to the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. It is the only federal supermax prison in the country, and the people who have worked there do not describe it in comforting terms. One former warden said it was about as close to hell as a free person could imagine, and that living there was a kind of life after death. Inmates spend roughly 23 hours a day inside a 7 by 12-foot poured concrete cell. The single window is a narrow slit angled so that a prisoner can see nothing but sky, with no way to orient himself inside the building. Meals arrive through a slot in the door. No one has ever escaped. And yet Kaczynski found something almost like community there. He was housed on what became known informally as Bombers Row, alongside Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh and World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Youssef. The 3 of them talked through the walls and across the exercise cages. In his own writings, Kaczynski said his neighbors on that cell block were nicer than most people he had known in the outside world, describing McVeigh and Youssef as intelligent and considerate. A former inmate remembered him differently, as a strange, withdrawn man who declined to go outside even when he was allowed to, and who liked to hand other prisoners IQ tests. He did not die at Florence. In December of 2021, after being diagnosed with late-stage cancer, he was moved to a federal medical facility in Butner, North Carolina. On June 10, 2023, he was found unresponsive in his cell and pronounced dead. The man whose ideas still circulate on the internet took his own life at 81, decades after the last bomb left his hands. The hunt for him became the longest and most expensive investigation the FBI had ever mounted up to that point. For 17 years, agents chased leads across the country, building an entire task force around a suspect they could describe only by the pattern of his crimes. The prosecution was supervised by Merrick Garland, a Justice Department official who would go on, decades later, to become the Attorney General of the United States. And when Kaczynski finally arrived at the Supermax, he became one of a small handful of household names inside a facility full of otherwise anonymous men. One warden there once compared inmates of his notoriety to a rare franchise player in professional basketball, the kind of figure who comes along only once in a decade, because most of the prison's population never makes a single headline. Kaczynski made himself an enemy of the American public from the outside, hidden in the trees, mailing his intentions to people he had never met. The man who would eventually occupy a nearby stretch of the same prison did the opposite. He spent his entire career pretending to be one of the country's most trusted defenders, while quietly working for the other side. Robert Hanssen. For more than 20 years, the FBI had a leak so deep and so damaging that it cost human lives, and the man responsible was standing inside the bureau the whole time, wearing the badge. He was a counterintelligence agent, the exact person whose job was to catch spies. He was also, by the government's own later assessment, the most damaging spy in the Bureau's history. The Justice Department would eventually call his betrayal possibly the worst intelligence disaster the United States had ever suffered. And for most of those years, nobody suspected a thing. Robert Philip Hanssen joined the FBI in 1976 and spent much of his career in counterintelligence, the discipline built around understanding how foreign services operate. He began selling secrets to the Soviet Union in 1979, using the alias Ramon Garcia, and he kept at it through the fall of the Soviet Union and into his work for Russia until the day he was arrested in 2001. Over that span, the FBI has said he handed over classified material in exchange for more than $1.4 million in cash, bank funds, and diamonds. Reporting at the time noted the payment even included expensive watches. He was, in the plainest sense, paid in jewels to betray his country. What he gave away was catastrophic. He exposed dozens of Soviet sources who had been secretly working for the United States. Some of them were arrested. Some were executed, including a Soviet general who had been feeding Washington intelligence for years and was put to death in 1986. Hanssen also compromised American surveillance operations and sensitive continuity of government plans meant to keep the nation functioning in a crisis. His danger was never physical. He never raised a hand to anyone. His weapon was information, and it got people killed on the other side of the world. The break came when the FBI paid roughly $7 million to a Russian source for the file on the anonymous mole they had been hunting. Inside that file was not a name, but enough to get one. Investigators identified Hanssen through fingerprints and a recording of his voice. On February 18, 2001, they arrested him at Foxstone Park near his home in Vienna, Virginia, moments after he had serviced a dead drop, leaving a package of secrets for his handlers to collect. He pleaded guilty to 15 counts to avoid a possible death sentence, and in May of 2002 he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms without parole. At his sentencing, he offered something rare for a man in his position. He apologized. He said he was ashamed of his behavior and that he had broken the trust of a great many people. Whether that shame was genuine or strategic, no one outside his own mind could say. That July, he was sent to Florence. And for a man who had spent his life trading in secrets, the Supermax offered nothing to trade. He was held in near total isolation, 23 hours a day in a concrete cell, cut off from the flow of information that had defined his entire existence. There were no documented incidents of violence against staff during his years there. His dangerousness had always been of a different kind, a national security threat rather than a physical one. But the containment was absolute all the same. He spent more than 2 decades inside those walls. On the morning of June 5, 2023, 5 days before Kaczynski would be found in North Carolina, staff discovered Hansen unresponsive in his cell. He was pronounced dead at 79. According to the Bureau of Prisons, no staff or other inmates were harmed. The most consequential traitor in FBI history died the way he had lived his final chapter, alone, in silence, in the same small room he had occupied for 20 years. Inside Soviet and later Russian intelligence, he was known by a rotation of aliases and code names, a man who existed to his handlers only as a series of letters and dead drops. He had operated this way for more than 2 decades, walking into FBI headquarters each morning as a trusted counterintelligence officer and slipping packages of classified material to a foreign power on his own time. The scale of what he betrayed is difficult to overstate. He gave up the identities of the most valuable human sources the United States had cultivated inside the Soviet system, handed over the details of how American intelligence conducted its most sensitive surveillance, and exposed the secret plans meant to preserve the government in the event of a nuclear strike. For years, investigators knew only that a devastating leak existed somewhere inside American intelligence. What they did not know was that the leak wore a bureau badge and sat among them the entire time. Hansen's threat was measured in secrets sold and sources lost. The next man on this list dealt in something far more direct. Where Hansen never touched his victims, the underboss who followed him into the federal system built his entire reputation on the number of people he was willing to kill personally. Anthony Casso. The FBI has given nicknames to plenty of the criminals it hunts, but there is one they reportedly used privately for this man that tells you almost everything. They called him Lucifer. Anthony Salvatore Casso, better known on the street as Gaspipe, was the underboss of the Lucchese crime family, and by the time the government was done accounting for his career, he had confessed to involvement in somewhere between 15 and 36 murders, and ordered many more. Even among mobsters, men not known for restraint, he was regarded as something closer to a homicidal machine than a businessman. Casso came up through the Brooklyn rackets, was brought into the Lucchese organization by a senior figure, and eventually partnered with Vittorio Amuso to run the family. His reputation for violence was not an exaggeration invented for headlines. He was tied to the 1986 car bombing that killed Gambino underboss Frank DeCicco, a blast that had actually been intended for John Gotti. And he did something almost no one else in the American mafia managed to pull off. He put 2 active New York City police detectives on his payroll. Those 2 detectives, Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa, became infamous as the Mafia Cops. For a monthly fee, they used their badges and their access to law enforcement databases to identify targets, and in at least one case, they kidnapped a man and delivered him directly to Casso. They also gunned down a Gambino captain in 1990. The people sworn to arrest men like Casso were instead working as his hunters, feeding him targets and pulling triggers on his behalf. And no, that is not something a screenwriter invented. The most notorious killing tied to Casso involved a young Gambino associate named Jimmy Heidel, who Casso believed had taken part in an attempt on his own life in October of 1986. Casso had him taken, questioned him at length to extract the names of everyone involved, and then killed him. Heidel's body was never recovered. It was the kind of act that even hardened investigators found difficult to talk about, and it defined how the Bureau came to see him. Casso spent about 3 years as a fugitive before agents caught up with him in 1993, arresting him as he stepped out of a shower. In 1994, he agreed to cooperate and become a government witness, which, given how many secrets he held, should have been a landmark for prosecutors. Instead, the deal fell apart. By 1997, he had been dropped from the witness program entirely, in part because of what he did behind bars, which included bribing guards, lying to investigators, and assaulting other inmates. He was a cooperating witness who could not stop committing crimes even while in custody, and that is exactly the sort of conduct that lands a man in a place like Florence. With his cooperation deal dead, the courts sentenced him in 1998 to 455 years for racketeering, extortion, and murder. He passed through the federal supermax at Florence before moving through other parts of the system, a man too dangerous and too untrustworthy to place anywhere with normal contact. He had, after all, outkilled most of the men he once offered to inform on. His end was quieter than his life. He was in custody at a federal penitentiary in Tucson, Arizona, when he tested positive for COVID-19 in November of 2020, during the height of the pandemic. He was hospitalized, placed on a ventilator, and died on December 15, 2020, at a Tucson area hospital at 78. The underboss the FBI privately called the devil went out not in a hail of gunfire, but in a hospital bed, on a machine, like so many others that year. Casso's rise had started young, in a Brooklyn street crew, before a senior Lucchese figure named Christopher Fernari brought him into a group that operated out of a social club, the beginning of his climb toward the top of the family. By the time he reached the rank of underboss, his appetite for killing had become the defining feature of his reputation. Years later, in a television interview, the figure of 36 murders was put to him directly, and he did not shrink from the scale of it. The 2 detectives he kept on his payroll were paid a monthly retainer of several $1,000s, an arrangement that handed a New York crime family something close to its own private intelligence service inside the police department. And the killing of Jimmy Heidel was remembered, even by the standards of that world, as especially cold. Casso wanted names before he was finished, and he took his time getting them, which is a large part of why the case still unsettles the people who investigated it. Casso ran his empire of violence out of Brooklyn, in the shadow of the 5 families, but roughly 100 miles to the south, in a different city with its own crime family, another boss was earning a reputation for bloodshed that could stand toe-to-toe with anything New York produced. Nicodemo Scarfo. He stood around 5 feet 5 inches tall, and men who underestimated him because of it tended to regret it, if they lived long enough to regret anything at all. Nicodemo Scarfo, known as Little Nicky, ran the Philadelphia and South Jersey crime family through the 1980s, and his brief reign is remembered as one of the bloodiest stretches in the history of the American mafia. One veteran crime reporter who covered him for years described him as a greedy, ruthless despot who seemed to take genuine pleasure in violence that served no purpose at all. Prosecutors simply called him prone to violence and impossible to predict. Scarfo's rise came out of a killing. He took over the Philadelphia family in 1981, after the previous boss, Philip Testa, was killed by a nail bomb detonated outside his home. Scarfo was not a newcomer to bloodshed even then. Back in 1963, he had been convicted of manslaughter for fatally stabbing a longshoreman during a dispute, an early sign of the temper that would define him. Once in charge, he presided over a period in which roughly 25 mob associates were murdered. That is not a typo, by the way. 24 killings in a single mid-sized city's underworld in the span of a few short years. His convictions eventually stacked up across several cases. There was an extortion sentence, a sweeping racketeering conviction that swept up 16 of his associates alongside him, and a first-degree murder conviction connected to the 1985 killing of a bookmaker named Frank D'Alfonso. In May of 1989, he was sentenced to 55 years on the racketeering and murder charges. What is remarkable is not that he was convicted, but how it happened. Scarfo's own paranoia and mismanagement drove the people closest to him to turn. Associates cooperated with the government, and among the witnesses who testified against him was his own nephew, Philip Leonetti, who had served as his underboss. The violence eventually reached into his own family. On Halloween night in 1989, gunmen opened fire on his son, Nicodemo Jr., inside a crowded Italian restaurant. The younger Scarfo survived, but the message was unmistakable. In the world the elder Scarfo had built, no one was truly untouchable, not even his children. Here is where accuracy matters, because it is easy to get this one wrong. Scarfo is often listed among the notable residents of the Florence supermax, and he was, at one point, briefly held or listed there. But his real long-term association was with the earlier federal supermax at Marion, Illinois, the prison that served as Florence's prototype. He was later moved to a federal medical facility in Butner, North Carolina. So while his name turns up on the rosters of the Alcatraz of the Rockies, he was never one of its signature long-term inmates the way Kaczynski or Hansen were. He was a man the federal system moved carefully, but not one who spent his final decade in that specific concrete box. He died at that medical facility in Butner on January 13, 2017, at the age of 87, still serving his 55-year sentence. His attorney believed the cause was cancer. The undersized man with the oversized temper, as one account put it, outlived most of the enemies he had made, and a good number of the friends who betrayed him before dying in federal custody, an old man. Scarfo had come up as an amateur boxer, and he never really lost the instincts of a man who solved his problems with his fists. His climb to the top of the Philadelphia family ran straight through the murder of his predecessor, Philip Testa, a boss known as the Chicken Man, who was killed by a nail bomb planted outside his own home. The violence that followed under Scarfo, some of it calculated and much of it simply impulsive, earned him a second nickname on the street, Lethal Nicky, and it was well-deserved. His convictions came in waves. There was a 14-year extortion sentence, then a sweeping racketeering case that pulled in more than a dozen of his associates at once, and finally, the murder and racketeering sentence of 55 years. A separate life sentence tied to the killing of the bookmaker was later overturned on appeal, though it hardly mattered given everything else stacked against him. What broke his organization in the end was not a single detective or a lucky break. It was the steady procession of his own men, including a captain named Nicholas Caramandi, and most damaging of all, his own nephew, who each decided that turning against him was safer than staying loyal to a boss they had come to fear. Scarfo's violence, for all its brutality, followed a logic that organized crime has always understood. It was about money, territory, respect, and control. The next man on this list did not kill for any of those things. He drove roughly 1,000 miles across an international border with a single, simpler goal in mind, and he was completely open about it in a courtroom in a way that shocked even the judge who sentenced him. Amor Ftohi. When the judge asked him, near the end of everything, whether he had any regrets about what he had done, the honest answer would have been the smart thing to hide. Instead, Amor Ftohi told the court the truth. He said he did not regret it. He said that if he had the chance to do it again, he would. And then he said the thing that likely sealed the rest of his life inside a concrete cell. His only real regret, he told the room, was that he had not killed the officer he attacked. There is a particular kind of danger in a man who says that out loud, under oath, with nothing left to gain. Ftohi was a Tunisian-born Canadian citizen living in Montreal. He was married, had children, and by some accounts, had been weighed down by financial troubles. On June 21, 2017, he walked into Bishop International Airport in Flint, Michigan, having driven roughly 1,000 miles from Montreal to get there. He had first tried to buy a gun at a gun show and failed, so he bought a knife instead, a blade with a serrated edge several inches long. Inside the airport, he approached a police officer named Lieutenant Jeff Neville and attacked him, stabbing him in the neck while shouting a religious declaration and referencing American military actions overseas. Lieutenant Neville was an adult, a veteran officer, and he survived. He suffered a serious neck wound and later retired from the airport police force. Bystanders and fellow officers subdued Ftohi at the scene before he could carry his plan any further, and his plan, as he later admitted to investigators, was not limited to one man. He had wanted to take the officer's gun and use it to kill as many people as he could. He told them his mission had been to kill and to be killed, and that he considered himself a soldier acting on behalf of a cause, following the ideology of Al-Qaeda and its founder. The investigation was handled jointly, with the FBI's Terrorism Task Force in Detroit, working alongside the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which searched his home and his computer back in Canada. The picture that emerged was of a man who had planned a second attack in the mold of earlier terrorist violence on American soil, and who had come remarkably close to a far higher body count. In November of 2018, he was convicted of committing an act of terrorism that crossed national boundaries, along with violence at an international airport and interfering with airport security. At his sentencing on April 18, 2019, United States District Judge Matthew Lightman handed him a life sentence. The judge said something striking from the bench. He noted that he had never before imposed a sentence anywhere close to this one, but that after hearing Ftohi speak in that courtroom, after listening to him express not a trace of remorse, he had no doubt whatsoever that it was the right decision. When a defendant uses his final chance to speak only to promise he would do it all again, he removes any argument for mercy. There is a coda to this one that stands apart from the others. Lieutenant Neville, the officer Ftohi had tried and failed to kill, later chose publicly to forgive him. That grace came from the one person with the most reason to withhold it, and it was offered to a man who would almost certainly refuse to accept it. Ftohi had moved to Canada from Tunisia in 2007, settling in Montreal with his wife and children, and by the accounts that emerged later, he had grown despondent under the weight of financial troubles in the months before the attack. What he did with that despair was not to seek help, but to plan a killing. The knife he ultimately used, after failing to buy a firearm at the gun show, was a large blade with a serrated edge, and he carried it across an international border, along with a fixed intention to spill blood. When investigators questioned him afterward, he did not hide his motives. He told them plainly that he considered himself a soldier of Allah, that he followed the teachings of Al-Qaeda and its late founder, and that his purpose that day had been both to kill and to be killed in the act. It is rare for a case to leave so little ambiguity about intent, and it is part of why the outcome in court was never truly in doubt. Ftuhi is alive, serving his life sentence, and listed among the population at the Florence Supermax, one of the men whose openly stated willingness to kill again makes every interaction inside those walls a calculated risk. His rage was loud, public, and unmistakable, the kind that announces itself in a courtroom. The next man was the opposite in every way. He kept his violence the way he kept everything else about himself, controlled, deliberate, and impeccably groomed, right down to the alleged plot to murder the very prosecutor trying to put him away. If you're getting something out of this video and you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time to do it. It genuinely helps the channel grow. Vincent Basciano. Most men who spend years in near-total isolation begin to come apart at the edges. The hygiene slips, the posture folds, and the version of themselves they once presented to the world quietly disappears inside the concrete. Vincent Basciano was not most men. Even after years locked in the federal supermax, reporters who saw him remarked that he remained impeccably groomed, every hair in place, as though he might be called into a meeting at any moment. He had run a New York crime family with that same obsessive attention to appearance, and according to prosecutors, he had also drawn up a plan to murder the federal prosecutor trying to put him away. Basciano earned the nickname Vinnie Gorgeous from a Bronx beauty salon he once owned, a place called Hello Gorgeous, and the name suited a man known for sharp suits, careful grooming, and a temper that ran hot beneath all that polish. He climbed to the position of acting boss of the Bonanno crime family after the family's official leader, Joseph Massino, was arrested. It was the promotion that would eventually undo him. His convictions centered on 2 killings from 2004. He ordered the murder of a man named Frank Santoro, reportedly because he believed Santoro was planning to kidnap his son. Later that year, in December, he ordered the killing of an associate named Randolph Pizzolo, described in testimony as a message to everyone else about what happened when you crossed him. These were not crimes of passion. They were decisions made by a man running an organization built on fear. Then came the part that reads like something out of a screenplay, except that it actually happened. Joseph Massino, the very boss Basciano had replaced, agreed to cooperate with the government. He became the highest-ranking leader of New York's 5 families ever to flip and testify for the prosecution. And in 2005, while the 2 men were both in custody, Massino wore a hidden recording device during a conversation with Basciano. On those tapes, Basciano can be heard boasting about being a hoodlum and a tough guy, someone prepared to accept whatever consequences came his way. Prosecutors would later allege that he had also expressed a desire to have a federal prosecutor named Greg Andres killed. A boss, in other words, brought down by the secret wire of the very man he had succeeded. A 2007 trial convicted him of racketeering and murder and brought a life sentence. Then, in 2011, the government pursued the death penalty in a separate trial over the Pizzolo killing. The jury convicted him but declined to impose death, and he received life without the possibility of parole instead. One prosecutor described him plainly as a cold-blooded and remorseless killer. That sentence sent him to Florence around 2011, where he was held under special administrative measures, the most restrictive conditions the federal system offers, in near-total isolation on a unit sometimes called the H block. Even there, stripped of nearly everything, he kept up appearances. And here is where accuracy matters, because he is often still described as a current Supermax resident. He is not. Around August of 2015, Basciano completed a step-down program and was transferred out, first to the high-security penitentiary at Florence, and later to another facility, with sources placing him in Kentucky. He is alive, still serving life, and his exact current location is not settled across public records, which is worth noting rather than guessing at. There is one more thread still hanging. A post-conviction effort tied to those secretly recorded Messino conversations remains active in the courts, with no relief granted as of early 2026. As for the man who wore the wire, Joseph Messino died in September of 2023, a cooperating witness to the end. The government did not stop at a single life sentence. In 2011, prosecutors brought Basciano back before a jury and sought the death penalty over the killing of Randolph Pizzolo, a rare capital case in the modern era of the New York mob. The jury found him guilty, but chose not to send him to the execution chamber, leaving him instead with a second sentence of life without parole. It was during this stretch that he was held in the harshest isolation the federal system offers, and even then the descriptions of him never changed. A man who somehow stayed pressed and polished behind a steel door. His eventual move out of the Supermax came not through a successful appeal, but through a step-down program, the slow administrative process by which even the most tightly controlled inmates can, over years of compliance, earn their way into marginally less severe conditions. Basciano moved through the system the way the federal government intended, sentenced, contained, and slowly managed down to lower security. The next man reached the same Supermax by a far stranger route. He was never a federal prisoner at all. He earned his transfer to the most secure prison in the country through what he did after he was already locked inside a state one. Dominic Maldonado. He called 911 himself in the middle of it, while people were still bleeding on the floor of a shopping mall. When the dispatcher tried to get information out of him, to understand what was happening and where, he gave an answer that has stayed with the people who heard it. He told them to follow the screams. That was how you would find him. Dominic Maldonado was 20 years old, and he had walked into a crowded mall 2 days before Thanksgiving with the stated goal of forcing the world to finally notice his anger. On November 20th, 2005, shortly after noon, Maldonado entered the Tacoma Mall in Washington state carrying a semi-automatic rifle and a pistol, and he opened fire. Before the shooting began, he had sent a text message to an ex-girlfriend warning that this was the day the world would know his rage. Inside the mall, he wounded 7 people, 6 of them by gunfire, and then took 4 hostages, holding them through a standoff that stretched on for hours before he finally surrendered. Remarkably, no one died. But the cost was still terrible. Among those he shot was a man named Brendan McCown, an armed bystander who was legally carrying a concealed weapon that day. McCown confronted Maldonado and, by his own account, hesitated to fire because the shooter looked so young, almost like a kid. That hesitation cost him. Maldonado shot him and left him partially paralyzed. Another victim, a woman named Roberta Davis who was shot in the leg, later confronted him directly, telling him that he had spilled innocent blood that day. The randomness of it, the ordinary Sunday shoppers caught in one young man's private war, made it the kind of case that lingers. Maldonado was convicted in October of 2007 of 15 separate crimes, including attempted murder, assault, and kidnapping. That November, a Pierce County judge sentenced him to roughly 163 years in prison, a large portion of which came from firearm enhancements that cannot be reduced for good behavior. In court, he said he took full responsibility for what he had done, and for a while, that seemed to be the end of the story. He was a Washington state prisoner, in the state's custody, serving a state sentence. But the Tacoma Mall shooting is not actually why his name appears on a list about a federal supermax. What put him there came almost 6 years later, and it happened behind bars. On June 29, 2011, at the Clallam Bay Corrections Center in Washington, Maldonado took a corrections officer hostage using a pair of scissors as part of an escape attempt. He did not act alone. An accomplice on the outside tried to breach the prison's perimeter by driving a forklift through the fence, and that man, named Kevin Newland, was shot and killed in the attempt. You would think a plan that elaborate would take a small crew and plenty of warning. Somehow, it nearly worked anyway. After that, Washington's Department of Corrections decided he was more than the state's own facilities could safely hold. Citing security concerns, they arranged to transfer him out of the state entirely. On May 11, 2016, under an interstate corrections agreement, Dominic Maldonado was moved to the federal supermax at Florence, a rare case of a state inmate being boarded inside the country's most secure federal prison because his own state had run out of ways to contain him. His current whereabouts, as of 2026, are genuinely unclear. Because he is a state prisoner who was only being housed federally, he may still be at Florence, or he may have been returned to Washington custody at some point, and the public record does not cleanly confirm which. What is certain is the reason he ended up there. A man serving over a century and a half already, who then took a hostage and tried to break out, is exactly the kind of prisoner the system decides it can no longer risk keeping close. By the time he walked into that mall, Maldonado already had a lengthy juvenile record behind him, a history of burglary, theft, and weapons offenses stretching back through his teenage years. Investigators and observers came to see the attack itself as something close to an attempted suicide by police, a young man who wanted the day to end in his own death and was willing to take strangers with him. The judge who sentenced him, a Pierce County jurist named Linda Lee, imposed a term so long precisely because so much of it was built from firearm enhancements, the kind of time that cannot be trimmed for good behavior. Whatever came next, the court was determined that he would not walk free again in any ordinary lifetime. Maldonado's violence was personal and homegrown, one troubled young man lashing out at strangers. The next man on this list operated on a completely different scale. His words did not threaten a shopping mall. They helped announce the deadliest attack ever carried out on American soil, and he delivered them standing beside the most wanted man in the world. Suleiman Abu Ghaith. There is a category of dangerous man who never personally fires a shot or builds a bomb, yet whose voice does more damage than either. Suleiman Abu Ghaith was that kind of man. In the days after September 11th, 2001, as the world was still counting the dead, he sat beside Osama bin Laden and appeared in the propaganda videos that praised the attacks and promised more. He was not a foot soldier. He was the face and the voice, the man chosen to explain al-Qaeda's violence to the world. And he had married into the family, taking one of bin Laden's daughters as his wife. Abu Ghaith was a Kuwaiti cleric who first built a reputation as a fiery preacher during Iraq's occupation of Kuwait in the early 1990s. His gift was rhetoric, the ability to move a crowd, and it made him valuable to a terrorist organization that understood the power of a message. Prosecutors and investigators would later describe him as bin Laden's propaganda minister, the public spokesman for a group responsible for nearly 3,000 deaths on a single morning in the United States. One senior FBI official compared his role to that of a consigliere in a crime family, the trusted counselor who speaks for the boss. In one of those post-attack videos, Abu Ghaith warned that the storm of airplanes would not stop. Prosecutors argued that this was not empty rhetoric, but a phrase that reflected actual foreknowledge of what was coming, connecting it to the attempted shoe bombing of a passenger flight by Richard Reed in December of that same year. This was a man, they said, who did not just cheer terrorism after the fact, but who spoke with knowledge of plots still in motion. For years after the attacks, he was out of reach. He fled to Iran in 2002 and later surfaced in Turkey, where he was finally detained in late 2013. He was deported to Jordan and then handed over to the United States, becoming the highest-ranking al-Qaeda figure to be tried on American soil since the attacks themselves. That decision, to try him in a regular federal courtroom in New York rather than a military tribunal, was itself controversial, a test of whether the ordinary justice system could handle a man of his stature. It could. In March of 2014, a jury in the Southern District of New York convicted him of conspiring to kill Americans and of providing material support to terrorists. That September, United States District Judge Lewis Kaplan sentenced him to life in prison. From the bench, the judge did not mince words. He told Abu Ghaith that he still posed a threat, that he continued to want to carry out al-Qaeda's agenda of killing Americans, and that he had shown no remorse whatsoever for his role. Abu Ghaith answered in kind. He told the court that in shackling his hands and moving to bury him alive, they were only unleashing the hands of hundreds of other Muslims. It was the statement of a man who saw himself not as a defendant facing justice, but as a symbol, and who intended to remain defiant to the end. His conviction was upheld on appeal in 2017, closing off his last real avenue of escape. Today, Abu Ghaith is alive and confirmed to be held at the Florence Supermax, one of the terrorists the facility was effectively rebuilt to contain in the years after 2001. He built a career out of putting terrorism into words, out of making mass murder sound like righteousness to those willing to listen. And now he speaks to no one, in a cell designed so that even the sky is the only thing he can see. The decision to prosecute him in an ordinary federal court, rather than before a military commission, turned his trial into a national argument about how the United States should handle the most senior terrorists it managed to capture. He was, after all, the highest-ranking member of al-Qaeda to face an American jury since the attacks, a man who had sat at the center of the organization's messaging during its most dangerous years. Prosecutors built their case in part around the videos, around his physical presence beside bin Laden in the hours and days after the towers fell, and around the language he chose, language they argued betrayed knowledge of attacks still being planned. His warning about a coming storm of airplanes was not, in their telling, the empty bluster of a spokesman. It was the confident promise of a man who knew what was already in motion. The jury agreed, and in doing so established that the civilian justice system could hold and convict a figure of his rank without ever handing him the platform he so plainly wanted. The next man never had an audience of millions, never stood beside a famous terrorist leader. He was a lone American soldier, but he tried to bring the same kind of carnage to his own country, and he found his inspiration in an attack that had already happened once before. Nasser Jason Abdo. The most unsettling thing he said came the day after his arrest, when he shouted the name of another man out loud, almost like a battle cry. That name was Nidal Hassan, the army psychiatrist who had opened fire on his fellow soldiers at Fort Hood in 2009. Nasser Jason Abdo was not condemning that attack. He was invoking it. He wanted everyone to understand that he saw himself as the next stage of it, and he had come within a hair's breadth of pulling it off. Abdo was an American soldier, a private first class who had joined the Army in 2009 and was stationed at Fort Campbell in Kentucky. His path took an unusual turn when he applied for and was granted conscientious objector status in 2010, after refusing to deploy to Afghanistan on the grounds that his faith would not allow him to fight fellow Muslims. That discharge process, however, was put on hold. In May of 2011, Abdo was charged with possession of child pornography, a charge he denied and claimed he had been framed for. That single fact belongs in the record, and it needs no elaboration beyond it. What matters for the rest of the story is what he did next. He went absent without leave over the 4th of July weekend and set his plan in motion. His target was a restaurant in Killeen, Texas, that was popular with soldiers from Fort Hood, the same base that had been attacked 2 years earlier. His plan was to build and detonate a bomb there, and then to shoot the survivors as they tried to flee, a deliberate attempt to recreate and even exceed the earlier massacre. It was interdicted at almost the last possible moment, and by something remarkably ordinary. An employee at a local gun store became suspicious of the items Abdo was buying and the questions he was asking, and reported him to the police. When authorities arrested him at a Killeen motel on July 27, 2011, what they found confirmed how close the country had come to a second tragedy. Investigators recovered a handgun, 2 pressure cookers, smokeless gunpowder, shotgun shells, and other materials, along with a military uniform bearing a Fort Hood patch and a copy of an Al-Qaeda magazine article about building an explosive device at home. Everything he needed was assembled. He was, by all accounts, days or even hours away from carrying it out. Abdo's conduct in custody only deepened the alarm around him. He was accused of spitting blood at guards while claiming it was infected with a serious illness, and he was made to wear a face covering in court as a result. It is exactly the sort of behavior that defines this list, the reason certain inmates are never handled casually, never approached without precaution. A man who weaponizes his own body against the people guarding him is a man the system learns to keep at a distance. In May of 2012, a jury convicted him of 6 federal charges, including attempting to use a weapon of mass destruction. That August, United States District Judge Walter Smith sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms plus 60 years. Abdo used his moment in court not to apologize but to promise that he would continue his fight until, as he put it, the dead were called to account for their deeds. An FBI official responded with a colder kind of certainty, noting that men who plot this way tend to spend the rest of their lives staring at the walls of a prison cell. That is precisely where Abdo is now. He is alive and confirmed at the Florence Supermax, a soldier who turned against the people he had sworn to serve, and who came terrifyingly close to writing his own name next to the attack he so admired. Instead, the only walls he studies today are the ones a few feet from his bunk. What stopped him was not a sophisticated intelligence operation, but the instincts of an ordinary retail clerk. An employee at a gun store in the Killeen area grew uneasy about the combination of items Abdo was buying and the questions he was asking, and passed word to the police. That single phone call collapsed the entire plot. When officers found him at a nearby motel and searched his belongings, the pieces of the attack were already coming together, waiting only to be assembled into something devastating. In the days that followed, Abdo made clear that he had no regrets and no intention of backing down, invoking the earlier Fort Hood attacker by name as a figure to be emulated rather than condemned. It was the kind of open defiance that erases any lingering doubt about how a case like his should end. The men so far have been terrorists and killers acting alone or inside tight criminal circles. The last man on this list commanded something closer to a private army, an operation that moved tons of product across borders and left bodies across an entire country. And he now sits in the same prison as the former partner who became his greatest rival. Alfredo Beltran Leyva. They called him the Fire Ant, a nickname earned not for his size but for his temper, the way a small thing can deliver a sting far out of proportion to its body. Alfredo Beltran Leyva was one of the leaders of a Mexican cartel that for well over a decade flooded the United States with cocaine and methamphetamine and enforced its business with a level of violence that prosecutors described as a sustained campaign of fear. He was a genuine kingpin, the kind of trafficker the American government spends years and enormous resources trying to bring down. And in the end, they caged him alongside the very man he had once called an ally. Beltran Leyva, along with his brothers, ran the organization that bore their family name. For a time, that organization was closely allied with the Sinaloa cartel, led by Joaquin Guzman, the trafficker the world knows as El Chapo. Together and separately, these were the networks responsible for moving staggering quantities of drugs north across the border. According to prosecutors, Beltran Leyva's cartel imported multi-ton loads of narcotics from suppliers in South America and protected that pipeline by ordering the killings of potential witnesses and rival traffickers. This was not street corner crime. It was industrial-scale trafficking, backed by industrial-scale bloodshed. His downfall began in 2008, when the Mexican army captured him in the city of Culiacan, deep in cartel territory. For several years he remained in Mexican custody, but the United States wanted him, and in November of 2014, he was extradited north to face American justice. The case against him was overwhelming, built on years of investigation into the flow of drugs and money, and in February of 2016, he pleaded guilty rather than face a trial he could not win. The sentence, handed down in April of 2017 by a federal judge in Washington, was life in prison. But it came with a second number that captures the sheer scale of his enterprise. The court ordered him to forfeit more than $529 million. That is not a typo, by the way. Over $500 million, the estimated proceeds of his share of the drug trade, signed away in a single courtroom. A senior official at the Drug Enforcement Administration described him as one of the true giants of Mexican trafficking, a man known throughout the underworld for his savage business tactics. For his part, Beltran Leyva offered the court something almost human at his sentencing, asking the judge for mercy and expressing hope that he might one day be able to return to his family. It was the plea of a man who understood, in that moment, that the answer was going to be no. There would be no return. The scale of what he had done, the tonnage of drugs and the trail of the dead, had closed that door for good. He was sent, eventually, to the federal supermax at Florence, where records place him since around the middle of 2022, transferred in from a penitentiary in West Virginia. And this is where the story turns almost poetic in its cruelty. Held within the same prison is Joaquin Guzman, El Chapo himself, the former ally whose Sinaloa cartel eventually turned on the Beltran Leyva organization in a war that killed countless people on both sides. Two men who once moved drugs together, then tried to destroy each other, now grow old within the same walls, each sealed inside his own concrete cell, neither able to reach the other or anyone else. For years, the Beltran-Leyva brothers were among the most powerful traffickers in Mexico, moving product in partnership with the Sinaloa network before that alliance curdled into open warfare. When the partnership shattered, the fighting between the two organizations turned parts of Mexico into a battleground and left a staggering number of dead in its wake. Alfredo's capture by the Mexican army in 2008 was one of the opening blows in that collapse, and it set in motion the long process that would eventually deliver him into American hands. His extradition in 2014 and his guilty plea 2 years later closed the criminal chapter. But the figures attached to his case tell the rest of the story on their own. Here was a cartel leader who moved narcotics by the ton, ordered the deaths of anyone who stood in the way, and built a fortune so large that the government demanded he surrender more than $500 million of it before locking the cell door behind him. That is the strange gravity of this place. It does not matter whether you commanded an army of gunmen, betrayed your own country's secrets, or tried to burn down a building full of soldiers. Whether you were a genius, a boss, a spokesman, or a kingpin, the ending is identical. A room roughly the size of a parking space, a slot in the door for your meals, a window that shows you nothing but a sliver of sky, and the certainty that the people paid to guard you will never, ever let their guard down. Of the 10 men on this list, 4 are already dead, and the other 6 are still locked away, most of them inside the one prison built to make sure they never touch the outside world again. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.